All right. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's so great to be here. I had a little bit of a technology challenge. Just when I think I've got Zoom down, I don't have Zoom down, but I'm not going to give up. So thank goodness for Lillian, because she helps me out every time. So here I am, Thursday afternoon. We have some very special guests with us today. I think that Dr. Day is going to tell you a little bit more about them, but suffice to say that a number of you who are here today have done some work with them. We have held some staff retreats for a couple of years, and they've helped to facilitate our retreats. And so we invited them today to help us start the conversation and really talk about what explicit and implicit bias is, and what's this thing that people refer to as microaggressions, and how does that all fit in with what we need to do in our world now. And our world right now is focused on LA City College, but hopefully whatever we do with LA City College resonates through everything that we do. So I'm not going to take any more time here. I think that Dr. Day is going to introduce both of our wonderful facilitators to you this afternoon, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Day.
Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Black Lives Matter Town Hall meeting, Understanding Microaggressions, Implicit and Explicit Biases. Every week when we have these town hall meetings, we present a topic that will help us move closer to addressing the issues of race, equity, and social justice. So today is no different. I'd like to begin by putting our topic in perspective by sharing some very important information. If you'll just take a visual back with me to the Obama administration, you'll notice that during the time that President Obama was in office, the country saw a resurgence of racism, civil unrest, and police violence in our nation. During his presidency, we saw those numbers continue to rise. And at that time, the nation began to focus on police brutality, civil unrest, and violence in our communities. Now let's fast forward to May 25th of this year. We all saw it, the George Floyd incident. The world exploded, and race, equity, and social justice efforts were escalated as the #1 priority in all industries around the world. But I want to share with you that the narrative is still the same. We are still wrestling with ways to address institutional racism, microaggressions, implicit and explicit biases. Every single day, we see these issues played out in the media, from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to our state government, local government, and unfortunately, we even see it in our own institution. These are some very disturbing acts, and they impact the lives of people, and they simply must be addressed. Oftentimes, it makes you wonder what's really going on. I want to share with you information that was shared by Peter Rice, who is the chairman of ABC. On Monday, he announced in a statement that one of his employees, Barbara Fadia, had been fired because unfortunately she made some racial slurs against 2 of their top employees. One was Sunny Hostin, who was the legal correspondent. She referred to Sunny as low rent. The other was Good Morning America anchor Robin Roberts, who was referred to as picking cotton. Microaggressions, racial discrimination, implicit and explicit acts are actually destroying many, many people, particularly the people of color. So today we have someone who's going to come in and help us understand the meaning of microaggressions, implicit and explicit bias, the effect that these acts have in our workplace, and they're going to share with us how they can be addressed. Ricardo Vidal and Deanna Cherry are facilitators who work with organizations to improve their cultures by addressing racial suppression and exploitation. By building trust and connection and having difficult dialogues, they create spaces for healing, leading to improved communication, well-being, and accountability. Rick has spent 20 years supporting systems impacted and unaccompanied youth, drawing on models of indigenous healing. He founded IPR Arts in South Central Los Angeles, an independent art and music studio where youth spend their time creating, developing, and leading their own arts projects, events, and businesses. Deanna, on the other hand, is a graduate of UCLA with a degree in intergroup relations and discrimination. She recently completed a 10-year partnership with the USC Center for Urban Education, where she traveled across the United States, facilitating dialogues on racial equity in higher education. Prior to that, she raised $13 million for anti-poverty programs. As you can see, Deanna and Rick are highly skilled, and they are ready today to address these issues head on. We are delighted and excited that they are here with us today. So without further ado, Deanna and Rick, you're on.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Great. All right. So we're gonna, when we get our video started, we can share our picture. But for now, we're gonna share our screen so folks can follow along. All right. Great to be with you.
It's a great honor to be with you folks, and be here and support, and be in solidarity with our Black community. As we go into these topics of microaggressions and implicit biases, we need to understand that there's a long history and that the trauma is real, that this has been impacted in our communities for 400 or 500 years, and that oftentimes, young folks in our institutions are impacted, by these aggressions, right? And these biases. So we want to be able to bring the history component to it so that we understand that this has been a long struggle for our peoples, and that today, as our young folks and our students and staff and faculty and classified staff, right, engage in these places, that this is still very alive, racism is alive, and that we want to figure healthy ways to address it and really resolve this problem that's impacting all of us.
And today we're going to focus specifically with an eye toward the impact on the Black community. But we want to recognize that the history of discrimination and oppression in the country includes many, many, many groups, and that what we're going to be learning today you can apply in multiple settings, but we do want to honor the experiences of the Black community today. So that's what we'll be focusing on. And I've been doing this work around implicit bias and microaggressions for about 10 years, and there's always more to learn. So today we're going to move through the material quickly with an expectation that there'll be more work to do and more research to do for everyone who's participating. So please excuse the brevity of many of the things we're going to share. There's scholars who spend their whole careers on these things, but we wanted to give folks a brief introduction to implicit bias and microaggressions, and then get into solutions and leave time for questions. So for those of you who have questions, please be collecting those throughout, and we will make the slides available so you'll have the opportunity to look at those again later. So we like to begin, and it's important to begin, as Rick mentioned, with history, because when we think about implicit bias and microaggressions, they're both grounded in subconscious beliefs And those subconscious beliefs are really a reflection of our shared history. And so we have very different racial realities coming out of that history. And many of us may not even know this history. So we're going to provide an abbreviated version of that now for those of us who you know, this is new to, and then for those of us who have expertise in these areas, you know, you'll find this familiar. So beginning all the way back in 1492, that's when Europeans came first to the Americas and began the colonization process. And the impetus there was really around the accumulation of power and of wealth. And about 200 years later, there was a need to build a rationale around the separation of those who were landowners and those who worked the land. And by that time, you had indigenous people enslaved, African people enslaved, and also you had indentured white servants and freed whites and freed blacks and others from the community. And there was a shared interest among all of those workers to consolidate their interests and politically move as a group. And in order to break up and divide the workers in this country at that time, there was the creation of this identity of whiteness, which didn't exist before 1680. And the impetus was around consolidation of power for the landowners, not so much for the poor whites working the land, but in order to create an interest convergence, white people who worked the land were provided the land that had been owned by other groups. And so with that, you had the continuation of the taking of land and the theft of land, and indigenous people's land was taken over a long period of time throughout the Americas. But legally, that process began with the justification that they weren't using the land in 1722. And then you move all the way to the West Coast, and you have the taking of the entire western portion of the country and the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848. And in that treaty, it actually designated Mexicans as white in order for them to have the justification for taking the land. And so those identities were contested. The whiteness of Mexicans was contested at that time and continues to be contested to this day. After the Civil War, you had a period of Reconstruction and Black advancement. Many Black folks became officials and elected officials, and their advancement, there's always a period of advancement and then retrenchment, was responded to with the Jim Crow laws in 1877. And at that time, segregation became the main tool of oppression. And so segregation in work and in housing and education and in all institutions. So, oh, and I'm just getting a note here that you can't see our screen. You can't see the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, folks. We've got a little bit of a technology issue. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask we PDF that over to some of the other organizers. So if they could please post the PDF, then since we're not able to post it on our end, it can go up, and I'll stop screen sharing. And perhaps that will work. Let me see. I'm going to try it actually one more time. Let's see. You can let me know if you can see it now. We're seeing it on our end, but it says you are sharing screen. We only see a white screen. Okay, so let's see here. I'm going to stop sharing.
We can see it now. Deanna, I can see it now.
Wonderful. How's that looking? Better?
Yes.
Beautiful. See, sometimes you have to overcome things, right? So as I mentioned, Jim Crow became the response to Black advancement during the period of Reconstruction. You had the response to Jim Crow of the Civil Rights Movement, which began, we think of in the 60s, but began all the way back in the 1940s. And there were always periods of resistance. There were always people throughout every era resisting oppression. And out of the Civil Rights Movement, you had a focus on access again to institutions, and then the Black Power and Liberation movements of the 60s and 70s focused on self-determination and autonomy. And the response to that was Nixon and Reagan's war on drugs and the movement toward mass incarceration of communities of color, which we're coping with the legacy of that now. And we're in the present moment of largely de facto racism, although, you know, with the current climate, you know, there's been an increased militarization and increased series of laws and actually the interpretation of existing laws around who's deemed a threat. And all of those things have been used to legally justify continued physical violence against the Black community. But we think of the current, and we have thought of the current era as more of a de facto racist period, because it's more in the lived everyday practices. And that's why we're focusing today on implicit bias and microaggressions, because that's how we see it occurring oftentimes in the classroom. So again, lots left out, but hope that that grounds us in the understanding of where do these stereotypes grow from, and why do we have these stereotypes that live at the unconscious level in all of our minds.
Right, and you know, the trauma that our communities have experienced, not only as folks who have been oppressed, but also the trauma that the oppressor has experienced through this process, you know, really just has impacted all of us, right? And when we look at our human basic needs, right, we all have physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual needs, right? So we all need to be cared for physically, to take care of ourselves. We all need the basic necessities to be able to live and thrive, right? So emotional needs, those needs are very important. We all need a sense of belonging. We all need to feel cared for, you know, so these needs are so vital to us as human beings that when we in the process of colonization, we've become disconnected to our spirituality. This was something that was stripped from us, our languages were taken from us, right? So that impact, that trauma that's happened to our folks, even though it's happened 400 or 500 years ago, it still lives in us today, right? So our students are still, you know, experiencing this trauma, you know, from the past today in our current times in our bodies, right? So how do we acknowledge this? How do we know that we all have these needs, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual needs? And how do we really start shifting away so that we can start healing from the trauma of racism?
So with that, it's important to understand our own biology. So we have a biological kind of construction, and our minds are constructed around three basic needs. You know, the first need that we have is for safety. And that resides in the reptilian brain, the lizard brain, and it's our instinctual part of our brain, and it's tied to our fight, flight, and freeze impulses. And we also have the limbic brain, which we think of as our emotional or feeling brain. And that is the part of us that really is driven to connect with one another. We have a need for connection. We're social beings. And then finally, in our neocortex, which we think of as the rational brain or the thinking brain, we're really driven to want respect, to look for respect from one another. And microaggressions really affect us at all three of these levels. They make us feel unsafe. They make us feel a lack of connection and a sense of disrespect. And unfortunately, when we're trying to address issues of race, we often feel threatened. White folks and folks who may be unfamiliar with these conversations can often go into a fight or flight or freeze response. So if you're experiencing that right now, if you're feeling uncomfortable, just know that that's part of your biology and that that's intended to keep you safe. And these topics can feel very unsafe, whether it's because we're unfamiliar with them, we feel we have something to lose, or for people of color, if you're feeling activated because these are topics where you have trauma. And so this is reminiscent of conversations or experiences you've had. So in order for us to address that need for safety, we need to take a moment and just take a deep breath, recognize that these are difficult conversations. So we're going to take a deep breath, blow it out, kind of calm yourself as best you can, and recognize that if you can get into a calm state of being, you're much less likely to operate off of implicit bias, and you're much less likely to invoke or create a situation where you're going to use a microaggression. So having a settled nervous system will allow for connection, will allow for more rational thought. So what do we mean when we talk about implicit bias? So implicit bias is really, it is a bias, but it can be positive or negative that lives below the level of consciousness. So we might be, it can be in-group, out-group. We might be inclined toward folks from our own group, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes we're actually we don't have affinities for people in our own in-group because we've been socialized according to the society to think of our own in-group in good or bad ways based on that history that we just talked about. So we want to be mindful that all of us can have biases, that it's a product of our socialization, and that they're both positive and negative. And this is important because we're asked to make decisions on a daily basis about who we pay attention to, who we hire for jobs, whose thoughts or feelings we find important. And so we find implicit bias being a big problem in the healthcare industry and in many industries where people have to make quick, in the moment decisions about where to put resources. And so it's really critical to recognize we all have these biases, and particularly in the United States, we have been socialized, whether we're born here or we came here as immigrants, to have an anti-Black bias. And so we have to work very diligently against any bias that we have that's an anti-Black bias, because that's really a legacy of this long history. In terms of microaggressions, that's really the action that grows out of that implicit bias. So these can be verbal or nonverbal. They can be something you do or something you don't do, but they communicate to the person who's from a marginalized group that they have less capability than you expected, or less capability than others, that we have these kinds of ideas that they're foreigners in their own land, recognizing that this land is not land that was traditionally land that was inhabited by white people. White people are immigrants to this land, or colonizers to this land. And so, you know, the thought about who belongs here, who belongs in our institutions, is all a function of this merit that we have decided certain groups have or don't have. And so that is what precipitates many of our microaggressions. And if you want more information, there's tons more to learn about this. The Kirwan Institute and Daryl Wing Su's work on microaggressions, the Kirwan Institute's work on implicit bias is really, really excellent. And we would drive you to those institutions and individuals for more information. So a few examples. There are 3 different kinds of, what are termed microaggressions. We've crossed out micro here because, as Rick said, there's really nothing micro about these, and they're cumulative, and so they're very, very, very harmful. The first is an invalidation, which is essentially really nullifying the experiences, feelings, importance of a person of color. And so a really common one is, you might have heard someone say, like, you must have had a really difficult time coming to this country. Where are you from? Those kinds of origin questions can be considered microaggressions, and a lot of times they're done in an innocuous way, maybe from a place of curiosity, but recognizing this person has likely been asked that question repeatedly, and so they may have been born here, right? So that's one, a micro-invalidation. Second is a micro-insult. So this conveys rudeness or insensitivity. It demeans somebody's identity. So perhaps faculty to faculty, staff to staff, you might ask, how did you get this job? Right? Assuming that the person may not have the qualifications, right? So they may say, I have a PhD from Duke University. And finally, microassaults, these are akin to what we would think of as traditionally racist behavior. These are, folks who are probably not unconscious of their bias, may be more conscious, but are using indirect ways in order to communicate that. So it may be as obvious as name calling, but it also is often avoidant behavior. And actually that's often pointed to as the most toxic of all the microaggressions, is to ignore people, to act as if they don't exist. And so that would be considered a microassault. It could also be something, like may have happened on campus, where a librarian may have called the cops on a student who was trying to study. It's ascribing kind of criminal intent to people of color, particularly Black people. And even mentioning that All Lives Matter is a current example, right, where we're trying to assert the need to attend to the validity, the importance of Black lives, and to respond with All Lives Matter is really to assault the fundamental core assertion that Black lives matter. So in terms of solutions.
Yeah, when we think about well-being as, again, going back to how do we take care of our needs, how do we take care of one another's? What do we do? What practices do we have to settle our nervous system? Whether it's breathing, yoga, stretching, exercise, I think it's important that we identify those things that allow us to have settled nervous system so that we can be able to interact with others in a respectful way, right? That whole thing about well-being and really caring for our students and our colleagues and the folks that we work with is so important. You know, if we do not understand that we're interconnected, we miss something, because, that's the importance of us seeing one another as human and really supporting one another. So well-being is very important in this whole process as part of our solutions.
And actually, implicit bias is triggered by stress. So if you're under any kind of time crunch, this is why in hiring, oftentimes in universities in the hiring setting, committees are on very short time frames. And so oftentimes those committees will revert to bias, and implicit bias in particular, in selecting candidates or selecting the final faculty member who's going to be hired. And so it's important in all of the settings that we have, to the degree that we're able, to reduce our level of stress. And this is why Dr. Luke Wood and Dr. Frank Harris say that, this online environment of COVID is actually ripe for implicit bias increasing. And so if you find yourself under stress because of all of the many things that are happening now, it's really, really critical to lower that stress to the degree which you can, to actually reduce the implicit bias that's likely to happen. Also with communication, always really important to communicate. And so, as a white practitioner of this work, I do find myself oftentimes microaggressing people, and, it's embarrassing. Oftentimes, I don't want to acknowledge that it's happened, but it's really critical that we acknowledge when we make mistakes. We are going to make mistakes. It's an inevitable part of building relationships and community, and especially because we've been conditioned this way. So what can you do if you microaggress somebody? Or what can you do if you see a microaggression or you experience a microaggression? So this is our 4-step recommendation of what do you do when you experience a microaggression as a perpetrator, an observer, or as somebody who has been microaggressed. The first thing you do is you focus on, we have these 4 needs, right? So we focus on the mental. Describe what happened. So you can say, what I just noticed is I pronounced your name incorrectly. I believe I, pronounced your name incorrectly. So you just describe it and then build some agreement. And then you go to the emotional. So I'm feeling embarrassed. I'm feeling a little bit unsure. And that's where you go next, is just be transparent about the feelings. If you're feeling angry, it's okay to name your anger. It's okay to name whatever your frustration that you're feeling. And then go to the spiritual. So we have shared values. So in my case, I might say, I really have a value for our collegial relationship. I really believe in building strong relationships, right? That's the higher value. And then you go to the physical in terms of repair. So if you've microaggressed someone, you can ask, what is it I can do to repair this relationship? I really want to apologize that I keep mispronouncing your name. And they could say, well, would you be willing to write down, my name in a phonetic way and say it maybe every morning when you wake up for the next 3 days, and maybe you'll remember how to say my name. But whatever it is that's going to allow you to repair that relationship, you can make a request or you can make an offering of repair. And that you work through this process repeatedly as often as you need to, because over time you will find yourself being much more aware, much more conscientious about your behavior. And if you observe a microaggression, you use the same process. What I see is that you did this thing. It makes me feel this way. We have these values, and I would like you to do this in order to repair it. And then finally, we focus on well-being, communication, and accountability. So there are 4 things you can do to hold yourself accountable. First is build your awareness. So if you find yourself to be in a segregated community, a segregated department, anything that keeps you in a homogeneous environment, it's important to go out and seek out counter stereotypical examples. Those are examples of people from groups, in this case, Black people who are scientists, who are engineers, who come from the backgrounds that you may not be as familiar with, and go out and seek out those counter stereotypical examples. And also build your awareness by building out your social network. So you want to actually make friends, socialize with people, and that will help to remediate and change the way that you think about groups you're less familiar with and you may be relying on stereotypes. The second is just acknowledge that we have this to work on, and acknowledge it to yourself, acknowledge it to one another. It shouldn't be a taboo. It shouldn't be a faux pas. We just need to acknowledge this is the work of building a beautiful, vibrant, loving community on campus. apologize.
Apologize. You know, it takes a lot of courage, and I think a certain level of humility to really just acknowledge that we all make mistakes, but to rectify and you know, the wrong that we've done. It's always good to apologize, right? And then go back and assess, like you know, how did that go? How am I doing? So it's this constant, you know, being aware, acknowledging, and apologizing and assessing when we do have a slip up, do something wrong. That accountability piece is so important, because how do we hold ourselves accountable and one another's in a just way, in a respectful way?
And finally, we'll say around accountability, we know institutions have formal processes. So there are formal processes that you can seek out in order to report the behavior. And we would encourage you to do that, because it's important to use those processes to the best of your ability to raise awareness and to, again, to norm it. So it's okay. To use those. All right, so what we'd like to do is have a poll. So we'd like, if Lillian or Camille can post the poll, we'd like folks to share with us, you know, have you been microaggressed in the last 6 months is the first question. And then the second question is going to be, have you microaggressed someone? And then we'll review the questions. So we can start to respond to questions. So there's the poll, it's up, so folks can respond to that. All right, let's see. Let's see, can folks share with us the results? And we're gonna start looking through the questions. Okay, so we've got 48% of folks feel that they have been microaggressed in the past 6 months. So almost half of us, and about a third of us can recognize that we've microaggressed someone. So, so that, I think that's, what do you think, Rick?
No, I think that this is common, especially, you know, sometimes it happens and we don't realize it, right? So we want to be mindful. We want to take, you know, the appropriate action to really rectify some of these things. And again, you know, students are coming into these institutions, and oftentimes we already have these, you know, perspectives, and we push them. And sometimes different people are going to respond in different ways, right? But if I'm having a difficult week and, you know, I'm you know, struggling just to survive, and somebody says something that might not seem as a big deal, but that could just trigger someone, you know, instantly. And then, you know, aggression is just going to beget aggression. You know, I don't like the idea that this is a microaggression, a micro insult, because, you know, aggression is never just, you know, small, and it needs to be acknowledged. So.
Yeah, and I love this. We're looking at the questions now. So anonymous attendee wrote in, something about attributing implicit bias to stress makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel like a cop-out. So, and then, you know, we're not negating your experience, but, you know, you're just going through a lot. So I really appreciate that comment. I completely agree with you. This whole topic of implicit bias is a little bit difficult, because it does seem to take the responsibility away from the individual who is inflicting the pain and hurt on other people. And oftentimes when we say things like you have to take care of yourself or reduce your stress, it can sound very delicate, like we're treating people with a real delicacy. And I think we always have to balance compassion with responsibility and accountability. And that's why we include accountability in the 3 things that we recommend. So, so yes, I agree with you. And oftentimes there are real dire consequences to implicit bias. We mentioned hiring is just one. So I just want to back you up that yes, it's important not to overemphasize the issue of stress and reducing stress. It's just part of the way the brain works is fight or flight, and we need to recognize that so that we can kind of get ahead of ourselves and hopefully reduce the amount of harm we're creating. Let's see. We're still looking through here. All right, so I think it would be good, we're talking about questions. Can we make these meetings more of like, I think an exchange? And so, yes, we would like to make these more of an exchange. And so hopefully going forward, we can have some workshops so that we can actually have more dialogue. That would be amazing. And I think most of these comments are really about the technology issue we were having at the beginning. So let's see, librarians don't call security on people who are trying to study. All right, so that's a really good point. I think typically we would like to believe that they don't, but I've been working on campuses across the country for the last 10 years, and I can't tell you the amount of complaints we get from students, particularly Black students, who do have security and police called when they're in the library trying to study, whether the assumption is that they're not a student or the librarian is responding to what is a slightly different cultural norm among the Black students, where they may not have other places where they can use technology. They may be spending extended periods of time in the library, and so there's suspicion associated with that, or associated with the fact that they're just there together in a group. And many of the folks that I've worked with who are librarians find themselves coming out of earlier generations with different expectations of what libraries are and how they should function. And so there is a cultural shift that is happening on campuses around the role that libraries play. And I have seen very innovative and beautiful examples of libraries that are gathering places and safe spaces for Black students and Latinx students, Indigenous students. But those are the exception at this moment, not the norm across the country. So I can't speak specifically to LA City College, but I do know that that is a persistent problem. So I would seek out those places on campus that are concerns for the Black students that you have, and where are they finding themselves over-regulated or over-policed, and then try to shift the norms in those spaces. And it may not be the library. Here's another question. As a result of experiencing the same microaggressions over a lifetime, I've developed a set of negative expectations whenever I interact with white folks. I always expect to experience the same microaggressions. Am I doomed to having these feelings, or is there something I can do to be less concerned with what invariably happens in my interactions with white folks? Well, unfortunately, I'm so sorry, Anthony, for that experience. You're not alone. And I do think that a lot of people have come around to believing that these things are inevitable, and actually brushing them off, and just allowing them to continue to do that harm on your kind of psyche. So, so first, I just want to acknowledge that the pain is real, and I apologize for your experience, and it's just horrible. I think that what has made a big shift in culture over time has been working collaboratively. And I think I don't know if you're a student, but if you're a student, staff, or faculty, I think working with others who are from your community or allies who want to create a culture shift on campus is the best way to actually ensure that at least your voice is being heard, and also that some positive movement can happen. So I think reaching out to others who have a similar interest might give you some courage.
And I think calling it out, folks are going to make certain comments, and I think we have to speak up as individuals and as a community and call it out, because people are not going to change if we continue this culture of silence, that for whatever reason, it's not called these things out. We have to call them out. We have to do it in a respectful way, and really just educate. I know oftentimes people feel it's extra labor to make people, but this whole fight against racism is really about, helping folks that don't see it really come to terms with it, that it's real, that it's hurtful, and that it's impacting them in a negative way, and that we need healing, And I think for me, I always feel that as folks who have been oppressed, we have such love and humility and respect, even despite all the years and the experiences of abuse, that there's something sacred about what we possess that can also bring healing and rectify some of these ills.
Yeah, so, and it is extra work, so we acknowledge that too. So let's see, we haven't been able to get our camera working, but next time we hope to be able to see y'all, and we'll get to see us. Let's see, something that we did that one. So there's a recommendation for a book, A More Perfect Reunion by Calvin Baker. Covers this history very well. Thank you for the recommendation, Eagle One. Really appreciate that. We'll put that in the notes. Let's see, what else? That may be it. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to do you think we have a trend towards a view of students as fragile? Have you explored the correlation between this trend and the rise in negative mental health outcomes for college-age populations? I'm not convinced that we are doing our students any good with the societal shift. Okay, well, that's an interesting point. There was, and I'm just going to respond to it, and then maybe Rick will have a completely different take on this. So in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was a focus in higher education on admission of students into institutions of higher education, because Black students in particular had been excluded from many institutions of higher education, which is why we have HBCUs. And during that time, the expectation was that Black students would assimilate into a essentially white, homogeneous white culture. And there was a tremendous cost on those individuals to do that in exchange for a degree. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, with Black Power movements and the rise of ethnic studies departments, there was an expectation that there at least be safe spaces on campus for students of color where they could get some care and attention. And we have the rise of EOP&S and TRIO and other programs that were intended to address the needs of students of color and low-income students on campus, kind of in enclaves. And what we have now, actually, is the rise of this question of equity. So the question of equity is not only about access to institutions or safety in small spaces on campus, but can institutions as a whole be shifted in order to serve the actual needs of students of color, given that on many campuses, they make up the majority of students now, particularly in the community college setting. So you have questions of race and dialogues on race becoming much more prevalent and much more centered on how do you change the core functions of the institution, as opposed to asking the students to accommodate that. And I think as backlash for really addressing the core functions of the campuses, you have this kind of characterization of students, faculty, and staff from communities of color as being fragile, when in fact it's actually the practices of the white faculty or other faculty who tend to exhibit a very low level of tolerance for these conversations. And so the resilience actually lives within the communities of color, because they've been able to kind of persist through these decades of trying to assimilate. And now we're asking the institutions to shift and change. And so I think that the issue of mental health is slightly different, because we also have at the same time the consolidation of wealth. Again, we've got the disappearance of the middle class. We have this lack of investment in the inner city. We have a lot of things happening that are broader economic trends that are impacting people's health and well-being. And so you've got the service industry growing, while all of these other kind of manufacturing industries and places people could get living wage jobs are shrinking. So there's many other things that are impacting people's mental health, other than the fact that we're attending to kind of some of the core racism issues within institutions. So that would be kind of my very cursory kind of approach to looking at that. And I think it's a brilliant question. I really appreciate the question. And I think it really merits, broader discussion. So
Dr. Day, did you have any questions or comments that you want to make at this point?
There are two on that you have not addressed, and I just wanted to make sure that you got to those. One is, there's a major generational gap among faculty what is appropriate language to address women colleagues? Is girl, lady, dear, sweetie, ladies? Are these examples of microaggressions? If so, how do you respond to them? That's the question.
That's a really helpful example of, it's really about the impact and not the intent, and it's really specific to each person. So I can imagine there are relationships on campus where calling someone sweetie is just fine. And I can imagine there are lots of relationships on campus where calling someone sweetie is not okay. And so it goes back to that 4-step process, where if you feel that you may have microaggress someone, say, listen, I just called you sweetie. I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. I really want you to feel respected as my colleague. Is it okay to call you sweetie, or would you prefer I refer to you by your name? And oftentimes this comes up also around using, you know, people's formal name, like you say, Dr. Day, or, you know, can I call you by your first name? So I think it's always important to be respectful, ask people what they would like to be called. That doesn't have to reduce collegiality or intimacy between colleagues. It actually improves it, because you can ask. I call people love a lot, and I need to be mindful that not everybody might like that. So I need to be conscious, whatever our patterns or conventions are. And I think for the women faculty, I think if you do want to have more uniform norms, it's okay to ask for agreements within departments. Just say, you know what? We've noticed there's a little misogyny going on here. The patriarchy is real. So we would like to be referred to as a group by our first name and not by, there's that movie Tootsie, right? So, you know, that movie makes the point, like, please don't call me, you know, Tootsie, sweetie, and all these other things. So I think departments can have those discussions and create agreements about how they want to, you know, refer to one another as well.
There's also another question that says, can you give an example of how to speak to someone who you observe microaggress someone else without putting them on the defense?
Well, you can't control how someone's going to respond, you know, and it's not uncommon when we get feedback that we become defensive. So a lot of campuses we're working with, we're actually, as much as we're training them to give feedback to each other, the training needs to be in place with how to take feedback, particularly in this era where we need to be giving each other a lot more feedback and learn how to take it. So I think you can start with, would you be open to some feedback? Or I would like to give you, I care about you, and I would like to give you some feedback. Would that be okay? And recognize they may say, no, I don't want to get your feedback. And those might be conditions where it's better to go through a formal process of complaint, but at least offer them the opportunity to get the feedback directly and informally and improve informally, and not take it to a formal process. I think that's a respectful way. So I think starting with like, hey, I've made an observation. I'd really like to give you some feedback as a colleague. I care about you. Would you be open to hearing some feedback? And then you can go through the process. I saw this, I feel this way. We have a value around caring for one another. Would you be willing to try this new thing?
And also communicating with the student or the person that was microaggressed. You know, if you notice that happening, then, you know, having that dialogue and really just, you know, being honest about it and discussing it. If people refuse it, and there's other formal ways of.
And you might need to clarify with the person you feel was microaggressed. Did they actually feel microaggressed? Because they might not back you up if they, in that case, didn't feel microaggressed. It's also an important point to make that microaggressions don't just impact the person who's microaggressed. It impacts the climate of the entire room, or the entire classroom, or the entire office. So just be aware that there are collateral impacts to witnessing a microaggression, whether or not you're one of the parties involved. And so it's okay to intervene if you're observing it, because it's actually impacting the entire community.
Yeah, I don't think there's no problem. I don't care how big it is, that cannot be resolved through respectful communication. But I think oftentimes, you know, again, there's this culture of silence and we don't speak up. And I think that it is time for us to really start, you know, having these dialogues and continue having these dialogues so that we can get comfortable. It's not an easy topic, but it's a topic that, you know, folks, when we've experienced this oppression for so long, you know, we're definitely ready to speak on it. And I think that providing the safe spaces and the platforms to do so is a good way to make this happen and create a shift.
So with that, we just really want to thank Dr. Day, thank the college, thank Dr. Gallagher for the opportunity to be with you and share our experiences, and hope that those of you who are interested in continuing the conversation will get in touch with us. We're available. Feel free to text us, call us. Those are our numbers. We got an email there, and reach out. We can continue the conversation and provide more kind of one-on-one support. If you do have a specific concern or question where you would like some coaching, we're happy to provide that. So please make use of us. We want to be helpful and useful. And all of this information that we have will be available on the website.
Deanna, there's one important question. I know we're running out of time that I do want to make sure that you address. And there are many academic topics that are inherently difficult to process with students. How can a professor navigate these topics without accusations of insensitivity, racism, or sexism? Many faculty are self-censoring due to the current environment. I think it's important, I'd like for you to address it.
So the question is, these topics might be difficult or sensitive, right, to bring up in class. Well, the first thing that we would want to maybe start with is on the first day of class, ask the class if they would be willing to help come up with norms for the classroom. So co-create a set of agreements or norms and say, listen, we're a diverse class. We come from different backgrounds. We have different racial realities. We have different economic realities, but we want to be able to build a vibrant community. So what are the norms? What are things that kind of are pet peeves for you in class? What are some things that, and especially in an online community, break folks into small groups and ask them to make recommendations for norms. The students are experts. They know, they're in these online classes now all the time. So you can ask them to create norms. And then you can say, okay, part of how we're going to use these norms is to call things out when they happen. So if I miss something, I would like one of you, we're going to all be responsible for identifying insensitivity, racism, and sexism in this class. And this is about our growth and development as intellectuals, as scholars, and as colleagues. Eventually, one day we're going to be colleagues to other folks. So we want to build this kind of rapport skill set. So you can ask, and then once you've set up the norms together and you've reminded yourself periodically of those norms, then when something happens in the classroom, you can say, oh, I think this might be an example of a microaggression, or I think and always the faculty can use themselves as an example. And there's a faculty who taught this with me once, who actually gave papers back to students and flipped the papers for the 2 Black men in his class. So he gave them the wrong papers. And so, and he's an expert in this topic, but of course in life, we make mistakes. So he directly addressed it in the moment, and then he emailed the students later to apologize for his mistake. So I think that, you know, having the humility piece and asking the class, now recognizing students are also going to microaggress each other. And so in those moments, really creating a safe environment, people can say, hey, I really feel like that was a microaggression. And then encouraging people to take it offline. You know, hey, would you like to have some time with me in office hours? I can help mediate that. And if you don't feel you have the support you need, ask for it. Ask your chair, your dean, for additional support and training and how to address these things, because there's a skill set you can definitely develop. And then this final one, if a microaggression impacts the entire community, mentally, physically, and emotionally, how do we, as leadership, shift? So, you know, that's a good question. I mean, as leaders, we have a heightened sense of responsibility, just like as parents in our homes, right? We have the responsibility to create a safe space. So if you're in a leadership position and you have not in the last 6 months recognized that you have microaggressed someone and taken responsibility for it, then you've probably overlooked something that you've done. So I would say first and foremost, as leaders, try to identify those places where you're attending to microaggress people, whether it's not acknowledging that they're in the room, whether it is calling on the same people over and over in a meeting, whatever that practice is that may be reinforcing these racial hierarchies, call yourself out the next time you do it. Be more conscious. Keep lists of who you talk to and how often and who you call on in meetings, and start to recognize your patterns. And then go to those people and apologize that you've overlooked. And once you begin to build those stronger relationships, the culture will shift. Once people see leaders do it, other people will feel comfortable doing it. And so it's such an important invitation to leaders to begin with the self. So I hope that answers the questions.
I want to remind everyone in the chat, if you have complaints, please make sure that you take note of the chat. Speak Up at LA City College. Any complaints can be sent to Speak Up at LA City College. Thank you, Deanna and Rick, for a very informative and thought-provoking presentation. My takeaway is simply, it starts with us. It's important for us to understand who we are. We need to know microaggressions and implicit and explicit biases impact people. So we want to be mindful of our own behavior. And now I'm going to turn it back over to President Gallagher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Day, and I so appreciate Rick and Deanna coming in. Every time I do some work on this, think about this, hear about this, I learn more and more. And I am so appreciative of having the opportunity to get together with colleagues, have these conversations, have these questions. There was a question that was asked about whether or not anything would be done about this. I am asking for you to please email speakup@lacitycollege.edu. That is a place where any sort of information that you have about something that you have viewed yourself, something that you have experienced yourself, will go to our Title IX office. I will look at all of these and I will follow up. I will hold accountable all of us to do this work together. And we have to change what is happening in our environment. It has to be better for our students, for our staff, for our faculty, for our administrators. We need to continue to work on respecting people. I loved how you showed that part of the brain about respect. This is about respect, and we've got to do that. It starts with ourselves. We have to do it with each other. Even if we get in a frustrated situation, it's really, really important for us to, as Deanna and Rick just said, take responsibility for what you've done, admit it, apologize for it, and work on correcting that behavior. And if the behavior doesn't get corrected, I'll help you work on it. That is my commitment to everyone. We have to have a better LACC, and it starts with focusing on Black Lives Matter. We need to help our students, our faculty, our staff, and our administrators feel as if they belong at LA City College. That is our job. Ultimately, it's my job to make sure that I hold everyone accountable, including myself. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. I don't know, Lillian, if you're able to unmute everybody, but if you can, that would be great. We're in a webinar, so I don't know if you can, but I really, really appreciate everyone coming today. We have an amazing lineup coming forward of this. We'll be sending out those who will be coming to join us for these. We have some remarkable people coming to work with us. So this work ahead, I think, is going to benefit all of us, and I really appreciate your participation. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.